Hey everyone, and welcome to the Student Ministry Podcast. This is episode 73 of the Student Ministry Podcast. My name is Steve Cullum. I'm your host, and today we're going to be talking to a good friend of mine, Brett Talley. Brett works over at Orange, and we're going to get to talk to him about what Orange is all about and how they can help you as a student ministry leader, but also what it's like to be in his role. He is what's called an Orange specialist, and so he gets into what that means, what he gets to do, and how he works with youth pastors and youth workers across the country and sometimes around the world, and what he does, and all the insights and everything that he has gained from working with a bunch of different churches he shares today. So I'm really excited for you guys to hear what Brett has to say. But before we do that, I just want to thank you so much for tuning in. And if you've not done so yet, please be sure to subscribe to the podcast. So every time we post another episode, you get it straight into your podcast app or service of choice. And if that podcast service allows you to leave a rating or a review, we ask you to please do that. That just helps us in a really, really great way, and allows other people to find the podcast. Speaking of which, if you have not shared this podcast with another youth worker who you think would enjoy this kind of content, please do that. That's another way that you can help out the podcast, and I would be very, very grateful if you did that. Beyond that, we are also on social media, so make sure you do follow us on social media. All those links are going to be in the show notes for the podcast, and we would just love to have you on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. We'd love to have your follow, and that's another way where you can stay up to date on what's going on in the world of the Student Ministry Podcast. And as this podcast is actually being released, I am on my way out to California for DYM 100. It's about 100 other youth workers and myself that we're going to get together with the people from Download Youth Ministry and just spend a couple days relaxing, having some fun, and just learning. It's going to be a great experience. I'm super pumped about it. Many of you that are listeners will also be there, so I'm excited to see a lot of you in person. And we'll see what comes out of that. I'll be sharing in future episodes some of the things that I learned. We're going to have some great speakers, as usually happens at DYM 100, and also a lot of fun. And just a great time to relax and kick back with a bunch of other youth workers. So yeah, if you're going to be there, be sure to say hi. Let me know that you listen to the podcast. That'd be great to just, be able to meet people that to listen every month. And it's just another great opportunity to connect. So before we jump into this conversation with Brett today, we're going to thank our sponsors of this episode because they are amazing and they are part of the reason why this podcast is able to happen. Our first sponsor is G-Shades. It's a youth ministry curriculum and teaching strategy focused on helping students see everyday life situations through the lens of the gospel. G-Shades has options to fit everyone. With 3 plans to choose from, this curriculum gives you the resources you need to do what you want to do better. Do you need message outlines, a discussion guide, and a game? That's just $16 a month. Looking for a higher production value, including bumper videos, Instagram devotionals, and parent guides? That's $25 a month. Do you want affordable youth ministry video curriculum that will help you increase your online reach during the pandemic? G-Shades has you covered for only $36 a month. You will not find a youth ministry video curriculum at that price point anywhere else. G-Shades does an excellent job of not just teaching students the typical things that we teach them in youth group, but allowing them to see every life situation that they go through the lens of the gospel. G-Shade's creator, Mike Haynes, has actually been on the podcast for episodes 32 and 55. So if you'd like to learn more about Mike, you can check out both of those episodes. So head over to gshades.org, that's gshades.org, to download Season 3 of G-Shades Youth Ministry Curriculum, and be sure to use the promo code TSMPOD, that's for the Student Ministry Podcast, so TSMPOD at checkout to receive an extra 10% off your order. G-Shades, seeing life through the lens of the gospel. Our other sponsor is MinHub Youth, which was actually developed by a fellow youth pastor. MinHub Youth helps you store and track your student, staff, and parent info, as well as attendance for your events. MinHub has a lot of features, but today I want to talk to you about kiosk mode. When you take attendance for events, you can long press on any student to quickly update their info if they get a new phone or switch schools. But sometimes you just want teens to check themselves in easily. So you enable kiosk mode so that the rest of the app is inaccessible. The students can quickly check themselves in, and you can also add new students to the database very easily. On its own, the app is only $5 on iOS or Android, and you can use it forever on that one device without ever paying any more. But if you want to sync your database across multiple devices or with your leaders, you can sign up for MinHub Sync service and support the Student Ministry Podcast by visiting minhubsync.com/SMP for Student Ministry Podcast. That's minhubsync.com/SMP. You can find the links to both G Shades and MinHub in our podcast show notes. Thank you so much to G Shades and MinHub for sponsoring this episode of the Student Ministry Podcast. All right, now it's time to get into this conversation with Brett Talley. Hey, Brett, thanks so much for being on the podcast.
Hey, Steve, how are you, bud?
Doing well. It's been great to finally get you on. I know we've talked about the podcast before, and
we have,
and you've promoted it before, so thank you for doing that. And I was like, hey, we actually need to get you on as a guest this time.
It's official.
I can
cross it off my bucket list.
So Brett, we've known each other for a few years now. I have the privilege of having you as my orange specialist.
Yeah, you do.
But because of what you do, a lot of people in the youth ministry world do know you. But I'd love for you to start off today, just kind of giving a sense of who you are a little bit more, but also dig into your story a little bit, and how did God get you to the point where you are today in your ministry?
Yeah, well, my name is Brett Talley. I'm a pastor's kid. I always start with that for some reason. I don't know. Like, it just seems like one of those things.
Set the tone ahead of time. Just know I'm a PK.
When people know you're a pastor's kid, they kind of like, oh, okay. Now I can start to, get a real read on you.
So those preconceived ideas, are they true?
Well, that is kind of one of the wild things, is that like my pastor's kid experience was very different in that my dad pastored the same church on the west side of Indianapolis for 27 years. And ironically, it was the church. My dad's from the South originally, but it was the church that my mom's family, like my great grandma on my mom's side, helped start that church. So the church I grew up at, which is very unusual, that you had a single church that I went through from, birth all the way through high school, the exact same church my dad was on staff at, was filled with cousins and aunts and uncles and all sorts of things from my mom's side of the family. So I had a very unusual PK experience where it was about as healthy as I could have imagined it to be, having, being in the business now and having conversations with my mom and my dad. It was really clear how intentional they were to shield me from certain things. And, there will be times where, I'll be like, oh my gosh, I haven't thought about this person in forever. Like, Dad, what's going on in their world? They're like, oh no, they hated me. And I was like, wait a minute, what? Like, I only had good thoughts about them growing up. Because I just feel like our family did a really good job of, helping church be a safe community for me, and not just kind of my dad's place. But I grew up in church. I've got an older brother, Steve, and we are kind of that yin and yang of the PK experience, where we both, grew up the same. We're wired a little bit different. The older we get, the more similarly we seem to be wired. But when we were younger, we were pretty different. And yeah, he's at a different place than I am, at least with faith. I mean, he's an amazing guy. He's a great dad. But just in a different place. It's kind of one of those nature versus nurture conversations. And one that I have a lot with parents, where it's like, there is only so much we can do. and our kids are going to make their own decisions. And two people, and I'm sure that, everybody out there who has kids or brothers or sisters or family have experienced this in some way. Two people can grow up in very similar environments and still end up in very different places and be very different people. So yeah, I grew up in Indianapolis, pastor's kid, total youth group kid, and loved going to church. Felt a call to ministry at about 15 years old and didn't really know what that meant. And ironically, I have a lot of conversations now. Obviously, I've been in the student ministry world for a long time. And there's this really interesting thing that I think happens around that age for a lot of high schoolers, is that is really for many students the first time that they seem to really understand what it means to want to follow Jesus, to really want to be a disciple, that they love God, they want to follow Jesus. And so I think that there are assumptions that get made when you're 15, 16, 17 years old that, well, if I'm really going to love and live my life for Jesus, I guess I'm supposed to be a pastor. And ironically, I usually spend most of my time trying to talk people out of going into the ministry, because it's not an easy place to be. And the reality is most of them aren't feeling called to ministry. They're just feeling called to be a disciple, and they don't yet fully grasp that it doesn't matter what you do vocationally, that God's calling you all over the place. Just use the gifts that you have, sort of a thing. But started to feel that call. And my student pastor was this guy named Craig Nisley, who's been one of the most influential people in my life, continues to be a very close friend to this day. And he was pretty young. I mean, he was 21, 22 when I was a freshman. So he's still in his early 20s at this point. But just doing a really good job, I felt like, of kind of walking me through what does call mean? What does it mean to go into ministry? And, through those conversations, went to a Church of God. I'm a Church of God kid out of Anderson, Indiana. So we don't have to deep dive in it. There's different Church of Gods out there. So we're almost like a, Wesleyan, Nazarene, Mennonite, Anabaptist cousin, sort of a movement. We're not a denomination, Steve. We're a movement.
Yeah. Very true. Actually, I think we talked about this at some point in the past, but I grew up in the Anderson Church of God as well. And so, yeah, it was, that was something I learned later on down the road as well. I was like, oh, okay, there's pretty strong lines there that make sure that we are not classified as this, but
that's true. We're very proud of our movement heritage. Right. And there are things that I love. I'm an ordained Church of God pastor. I love the Church of God, but went to a Church of God school and decided I wanted to jump straight into ministry. So at 21 years, so I graduated high school early. I'm one of those, like, part of my weird story is I hated high school so much. I didn't enjoy middle school and I hated high school. I don't know what it was. And, I don't, people would say, like, I wouldn't go back to high school for $1 million. And I still don't think I would. But in some ways, like, I would love to go back and make some really different decisions, like, I didn't make a lot of bad decisions, like morally bad decisions. I just got to a place in my faith where I got so apathetic about everyone around me making choices that I just didn't understand and didn't make sense to me. And I had this swing where in middle school, I cared so much about what people thought about me. And then in high school, I swung too far and I just stopped caring about people in general. So rather my value and worth not coming from them, but coming from God, I just stopped caring about people. I got really apathetic. I feel like I just wasn't I was not a very good example of what it meant to be a follower of Jesus in high school. But for whatever reason, have just continued to always be drawn to that phase and age of life. And so jumped into student ministry full time at 21. I graduated high school, graduated college early. I got married at 20. I'm one of those weird, Christian college kids that got married at a really young age. And it's funny because now, like, I'll have former students that are in their late 20s that will be like, hey, Brett, I just got engaged. And I'm like, ooh, at 28, are you sure that? And it's like, oh, wait, like I got engaged at 19 and married at 20. But yeah, getting married young it's wild, but it's worked out for us. We've been married 17 years.
Cool.
Yeah. So we both jumped into full-time ministry in the Lexington, Kentucky area at a church there for 4 years. Felt compelled. And I use that word specifically. For me, I never necessarily felt called to ministry changes in life. I just kind of felt compelled to them. I've always kind of had this sense that, when we took the role at the church in Kentucky and then back in Indianapolis for 7 years, and then this role that I have with Orange, I never necessarily felt like that was God saying, hey, here's what I want you to do next. I've always felt in ministry that there has just been this open-handed sense of I have opportunities come and I have opportunities go. And God is kind of, trusting me to evaluate and have conversations with people around me and obviously my wife and my family and try to discern, is this something that would be a good thing for us? Do I feel like this fits, my passions and my gifts and everything along those lines? And, is it something that I feel like I can continue to have a broader, greater influence in the kingdom? And so those have kind of been the determining factors. When we went to Kentucky, that's kind of what it was about. When we moved back to the north side of Indianapolis, that's kind of what it was about. And we spent 7 years there. And it was there that I really started to learn about Orange. And I read Think Orange, and I started reading Lead Small and going to Orange Tour and Orange Conference and XP3, and really just loved the ideology and the philosophy and the strategy that Orange was trying to do. And eventually jumped on board and started working full time with them. And, my experience with a lot of the Orange stuff is like, I'm just reading so much of it saying, yes, like this is what I'm trying to do. Like for so much of it, it wasn't necessarily brand new ideas to me, but I had never been able to clarify them in that way. I'd never been able to structure them. And I remember so this is kind of a funny story. So in my kind of interview process, there was Orange Tour was in Indianapolis near where I was. And so I was going down and kind of hanging around and meeting some people, and then got invited to dinner afterwards, after Orange Tour. And so I'm sitting at a table with me and my wife, with Reggie, Carrie Newhoff, Kristen Ivy, and then Debbie Joyner, Reggie's wife, who's my direct report, my boss. She's awesome. And I'm sitting there feeling completely overwhelmed and unequipped as a leader is how I feel. But I say something along those lines, and Reggie was like we hear that a lot, that what we do isn't necessarily like, oh my gosh, I've never thought of that for a lot of people, but the way that the intentionality that Orange takes to communicate it in a certain way. And, Reggie, what I always say that Reggie is so good at is he's so good at stepping on people's toes. Because he uses a lot of like, now imagine if we, can you think about what would happen if we, and then you don't realize that he's really challenging so much of the way that you've kind of understood things. But jumped into that whole world, was using XP3 for years. And Jeremy Zock was my Orange specialist. And, I was pretty connected with him and had a good relationship, and we got to know each other a little bit. And just through some different conversations, had some friends. My friend Leslie was on staff there, and they were looking for an XP3 Orange specialist, and started having some conversations with them. And I never thought I would do anything but local church ministry for the rest of my life. I wasn't sure I would ever be a senior pastor anywhere. There were aspects of that just still to this day seem like, why would you even want to do that? And it was just one of those pieces where, again, the more we had conversations, the more I learned about the role, the more I feel like it really fit with where a lot of my passions and a lot of my gifts were. And it was sort of like, talking to my wife, do we want to move from Indianapolis around a bunch of family, down to the north side of Atlanta and have a little adventure? And our kids were 2, 4, and 6. And we were like, well, if we're going to move far away from home, like we'd rather do it when they're this age than when they're 12, 14, 16. So we moved down here in 2016, this role of Orange Student Specialist, which, if you're not familiar, Orange has a middle school and high school curriculum called XP3. And for anybody who has an XP3 middle school or high school license, part of that is you get a free kind of ministry coach along with that partnership. And so that's what I get to do. And then I get to work with Candace and Charlie are the other student OSs. We got a bunch of kids OSs too that are awesome. And we essentially get to spend our time really on calls like even like this with you, Steve, and just kind of talking about people's story and talking about people's ministries and what's working and what's not, and troubleshooting and kind of dreaming together. And sometimes we talk Orange and we talk XP3 and we talk about Parent Q and we talk about YouVersion Devos and communicator guides, and sometimes we talk about implementation with some of those things. But a lot of times we spend time talking about ministry systems and how do we care for leaders and how do we recruit and just all of those pieces. So I'm fortunate enough to have what I call ministry hive mind right now, where I just get to talk to leaders like you that are literally all over the world, and just kind of learn and dream and brainstorm together. So that's a little bit of my story. Part of my story. This
Cool.
is something that's just going to make people jealous. So when we moved down here, my full-time job obviously is with Orange. And so for the first time ever, I'm not going to a church that my dad pastors at or that I pastor at. So when we moved down here, for the first time in my life, we were looking for a church home, like just for us to be a part of. And I volunteer in our middle school ministry. My wife and I volunteer in our middle school ministry. And I get to wake up with my family on a Sunday morning and have all the arguments about what they're going to wear, with my wife, not just her by herself.
Yeah.
So it's been an interesting transition going from full-time pastoral ministry to kind of this, parallel kind of ministry, and being able to stay involved as a volunteer has been wild.
Yeah. Yeah. That's so cool. Well, I'm gonna detour us just a little bit before we jump back into that, because there might be some people listening to the podcast that maybe don't know about Orange yet, and so I'd love for you to get just a little bit. Maybe I've had Crystal Chang on the podcast before. I've also had Jeremy, who you mentioned, on the podcast before. So if people have listened to other podcasts, maybe they've gotten an explanation, but those were a little while ago. So give us a brief rundown of what Orange is all about, for the few people out there that don't know what it is.
Yeah, at the broadest level, Orange is really about the name Orange. So, we say that red is the heart of the world, which is the family. The yellow is the light of the world, which is the church. And when those two combined influences are together, it makes a greater impact. And so really at the heart of what we do is all about family ministry. And it's about how can we, number one, help the church better partner with parents. And then number two, help better equip parents to be the lead spiritual guide in their families. We say that roughly a church has about 40 hours a year with a student, and that's pre-COVID. So that's probably even less now.
Right.
And a parent has 3,000 hours of potential influence a year. That's pre-COVID. That's probably more now. So how foolish are we as the church to think that we can give kids and students everything that they need spiritually for a healthy, resilient faith in the 30 to 40 hours a year at best that we get from them. And so, yes, what matters, what happens at church matters, but what happens at home matters more. So, we do Orange Conference, Orange Tour, we do, events, we write books, we have obviously the curriculum, preschool curriculum, elementary, preteen, middle school, and high school curriculum. So we do all these things to try to create these resources. Orange Leaders does all sorts of, training content for parents and for leaders. We do all these different things to try to create these resources essentially so that leaders like you, Steve, and leaders that are listening that are week in and week out trying to lead these ministries, we're trying to free you all up to do what only you can do, because we can do all the stuff on the back end to help create resources, to help create series and graphics and bumpers and scripts and different things like that. So that my analogy is we can get you to the 30-yard line. You still got to make it a touchdown for LifeBridge. You still got to figure out, okay, how do we contextualize? How do we adjust this? Actually, I want to go a little bit deeper here with this, or this would be better for our parents. You're still going to need to do that. But hopefully we've freed up a lot of your time and energy to be able to pour into leaders, pour into parents, pour into students, think about your ministry systems, think about your vision and your mission and all of those different pieces. So that would be kind of my spiel about what we try to do at Orange.
Cool. Yeah, it's something that I've loved about it as well. I kind of got tossed into it in the beginning. We used a different curriculum. It got merged with XP3, and then all of a sudden I was doing this. But the more that I looked into it, I was like, oh, okay. And I think it was very similar to you. Is like it wasn't earth-shattering, like brand new information, but just a way of articulating it that I was never able to wrap my head around fully. And I feel like that's why I've seen kind of eye to eye with Orange for so
Yeah.
long, because it's really the stuff that they got already placed in me, but I was just having a hard time, putting it on paper or saying it myself. And all of a sudden I come across how Reggie puts it in a book or on stage, or how a certain curriculum is written or whatever. And I go, yes, that's what I've been thinking. I just couldn't put it on paper myself. So that's been a really cool. So I know a lot of people are probably wondering, okay, what's life like as an Orange specialist? So you're in ministry, but like this parachurch, you get to work with a bunch of different youth pastors around the country, sometimes around the world. Like what is that like on a day-to-day basis? What does your ministry look like, I guess? Because you kind of run down all the different things that you do, but I guess if I could like be like a middle schooler in my ministry and go, hey, what do you do during the week as a youth pastor? Yeah. What do you do?
You just work on Wednesdays, right? Or on Sundays. What do you do during the week?
Yeah. What do you have a life outside that?
Oh man.
So yeah, what does it look like to be an Orange specialist, a coach? What's that? How does it all work, I guess?
Yeah. So, I would say there's a few different buckets that we tend to work at, which everybody in ministry understands what that's like. You always you're always wearing multiple hats at any given time. And so my specific Orange specialist role is, it's really, it's reaching out to leaders. One of the challenges is not everybody knows what an Orange specialist is. It's just people don't to be honest, people think we're salesmen or that we're just kind of their curriculum rep, and they only reach out if it's like, hey, this file's not working, which is fine. And
I'll be honest, that was me for a long time. I was like, oh, wait, these guys can do more than that? Okay, cool.
Yeah. And hey, file doesn't work, I'm happy to help about that. But yeah, ultimately, like I've said, it's our role and it's our hope to be able to connect relationally with leaders. Leading in student ministry can be really lonely when you are oftentimes the only staff person in your church who is passionate about middle school and high school students, and you're constantly trying to make things as good as possible for middle school and high school students, when, if we're honest, a lot of other church leadership is less interested about making things best as possible for middle school and high schoolers, and they're thinking more about how to make things best as possible for adults. And then high school, middle school, you guys figure out what to do within this structure that we've already created. It can just be frustrating. It can be challenging. And so, part of what we want to do is just relationally connect. I'm not joking that there are some conversations I have with people where the main focus is just like allowing them a safe place to vent. And for me to be like, yeah, that sucks. Like, it's not like, that's not fair. Like, sometimes we'll get into like, okay, do we want to troubleshoot? Do we want to talk through what, some potential things? But sometimes like it's just good to talk to somebody who knows what it's like to be in ministry and not to be able to do some of the things that you really like to do. But yeah, a lot of times, we'll have somebody reach out and they're saying, we're having a real hard time with recruiting. Can we brainstorm with you? Sometimes, I get brought into kind of some student ministry staff meetings, and they're just kind of thinking about, hey, we've got our weekend retreat coming up, and here are some things we're thinking. Are you seeing any gaps? Are you seeing any holes? Or we do these thing called roundtables, which I absolutely love, where we just started them in the last year or so in the midst of the pandemic, where we've had some about, obviously volunteers, small group strategy, creating healthy boundaries, becoming a better communicator. But they're basically just kind of these roundtable conversations that I try to facilitate with other leaders that are trying to think about the same things. And it's literally, it's not a breakout. It's not me delivering content. It's us sitting around a virtual table, because obviously it's on Zoom. And we're just asking ourselves, what are we learning about this? What have you tried? What has worked? What hasn't worked? That we can kind of learn from each other. So those, that's a big part. Obviously, one of those buckets too is working with the Orange students team and, having some conversations and helping however I can when it comes to navigating what kind of resources we're doing, or, helping out however in XP3 that we can. And then we also have an awesome team of Orange specialists that we get to, kind of develop and hone our skills together with. But yeah, it's one of those things where sometimes every day looks different. But to me, the hallmark of what I get to do is kind of walk alongside of student pastors and being able to hopefully push them outside of, the tyranny of the urgent was always something I struggled with in student ministry. Is, Wednesday's coming, Sunday's coming. I've got this I've got to do. I've got that I've got to do. There's this fire. I got dragged into this all church thing that I'm not really excited about, but it's going to take 4 hours of my time this week. And I'm sitting in this meeting and that meeting. And so one of my favorite things to do is just have conversations with leaders and, and trying to give them some space to think bigger and to think broader and to dream and to brainstorm, to troubleshoot, all those kind of fun things.
So from your work with all these youth workers from all over, what are some of the trends that you're seeing and what's working, what's not working, especially in light of the pandemic and everything lately, the last couple of years? What are you seeing in terms of trends and what is working, what's not working?
So my answer in fall of 2021 is what are we seeing? We're seeing that everyone is struggling and wondering if we're seeing anything that's working in other churches because they feel like nothing is working. Like that is a pretty, and I don't say that to be discouraging to everybody, but encouraging in the sense of nobody has ministry figured out in, the fall of 2021. If we're honest, some of us thought we had some ministry stuff figured out maybe in the summer and the fall of 2019. And there are some things that were far easier and were far more effective in the fall of 2019 that just aren't right now. And so I think across the board on a regular basis, we're hearing from ministries, we're hearing from churches that are saying, hey, what are you seeing that's working in other churches? Because we are struggling, like everything is like pulling teeth. It's like walking through quicksand. And, the reality is that the churches that are probably finding the most success right now are the ones that have the best relational structures in place. And that was probably true of them before the pandemic hit. So one of the things that, and this isn't, some crazy observation, this is probably obvious for a lot of people, but, before the pandemic hit, so often in student ministry, when it came to volunteers, we often recruited volunteers to help us pull off programs. And so volunteers felt like that their role was tied to a program. Even if we structured their role to be like, hey, will you come hang out with the 8th grade boys on Wednesday nights during Ignite or, during whatever, the name of your program might be for middle school or high schoolers. Then the pandemic hit, there's no longer a program. And those volunteers who felt like that they were helping pull off a program no longer felt like that they had a necessary role. And those churches whose ministry structures were not built around programs, but were built around people, and they were built around the idea of relational discipleship, where if I am the small group leader of these 8th grade boys, it's not that I show up on Wednesday nights so that these 8th grade boys have a place to go for 20 minutes after the message, but that you have called and equipped me to be the shepherd and the pastor of this group of 6th grade boys over these 3 years of middle school. And the program, the environment, sometimes I like to use the word environment. They're basically, it's semantics to me, but in some ways, environment perpetuates a better understanding of that it's not about, the environment is just one place where your shepherding can happen. But your shepherding happens throughout these 3 years in 100 different ways. And so the ministries who are structured around that, what the language, the orange language would be lead small, life groups, small groups. Really, we're talking about relational discipleship as kind of the churchy word, the pastoral word that I would use. But churches that were structured around that idea of relational discipleship, that the leaders in their ministries understood that it's not just about what happens on a Sunday or what happens on a Wednesday, but I feel relationally and spiritually responsible for this group of students. Those were the ones, I can't say that those were the ones that didn't experience, any attendance drops. Those were the ones that, suffered no momentum loss. That's not true. All of us have struggled through those pieces. But as far as health and as far as, effectiveness and being able to continue to move forward with kind of, vision, mission, strategy, those are the ones that we feel like have held up a little bit better, where there was already that culture in place, where there was already that kind of a system in place. And to be honest, it was a barometer for a lot of ministries to say, oh my gosh, like my 6th grade groups, my 7th grade groups, and my 9th grade groups were awesome. Like they really bought into this. My 8th grade groups, the leaders were not where I needed them to be when this happened. So it's not even necessarily your ministry either was this or it wasn't this. Even within ministries, we can probably pinpoint, leaders that maybe weren't where we hoped they were, or weren't where we thought they were, or even, specific groups that were connected in ways that we hoped for, but other groups that just hadn't got there.
That's really good. Yeah. Because I think we kind of fell in that place where we were very relational already, very small groups driven, but it did allow us, it shed some light on some different areas that we need to work on. And that since then we've added additional training and different things like that to make sure that we're getting our leaders up to that standard, because it's very important. But that's cool to hear that that's what you're seeing, because it's what our environment was, but that's the kind of the benefit that you get is like talking with all these different church leaders and seeing that. So as we wrap up today, there's, I'm sure I know there's tons of wisdom. You've already shared a ton of it already, but maybe one or two other tips that you would share with our podcast listeners out there from your years in ministry yourself in the local church, but then also now being able to work with all these different youth leaders from all these different churches, all these different communities and cultures and stuff. What are a couple of tips that you would share with our listeners today?
So the first one, I'm going to go into some phase strategy here. So another thing that we do at Orange is a thing called the Phase Project. You can go to justaphase.com. You can learn more about that. If you're a ministry leader, if you are working with kids or middle schoolers or high schoolers, and you have not read, I don't know if any of this is going to be video, but I'll hold it up. But if you have not read this book, it's Just a Phase. Don't miss it. I can't encourage you enough to jump in and read that. There's so much, this came out before I was working for Orange, and it was a game changer in a lot of ways. But one of the pieces with that in mind that I would want to kind of encourage all ministry leaders is that your final filter should be, what is the most helpful thing for me to talk about for the faith development of the students that I'm talking to? One of my taglines that I say a lot is that what gets taught to kids and students all around the world on a weekly basis usually has more to do with how the adult feels when they leave than what is best for the development of a healthy, resilient faith for the kids and the students they're talking about. And sometimes I think we can misuse some scripture and we can walk out thinking, hey, I brought the word, I planted the seeds, it's up for the Holy Spirit to make it grow. But, the reality is that we do have a pretty big role when it comes to what kind of, culture or soil, or how easy is it for the Holy Spirit to be able to cultivate some of that movement. And I mean, I like even I, kind of struggle in my own mind with some of those pieces, but I just think that there's a reality there. Sometimes what we talk about to kids and teenagers has more to do with what we feel like we're supposed to talk about than necessarily what is the best thing. So for me, the ultimate filter, that final filter, isn't even what's true. And I'm trying not to be blasphemous or anything here. Obviously, what is true, what is wise, like, those are pieces that should be some of our final filters. That is a filter. But then we should go through the filter of, but if I'm talking to high school students, what is the most beneficial thing for me to talk about? What is the most helpful way for me to talk about this, for them to develop a healthy and a resilient faith.
Mm.
And I kind of go back and forth with this idea between biblical literacy and faith formation. Is sometimes in the church, we get so stuck with this idea of biblical literacy, but I'm telling you, I have known so many people in my life who are more biblically literate than I am that never understood or learned how to turn it into a healthy, resilient faith. And so that's just kind of one of those drums that I'm constantly beating, of that final thing before you give that message, before you talk to those students, going through the filter. Do you know what's happening in the brain, in the mind, socially, developmentally, in the ages of 6th, 7th, and 8th graders, of 9th and 10th graders, 11th and 12th graders, so that you can communicate this in a way that is most beneficial for what, not you. I'm 37 years old. I'm looking at, like a Jewish New Testament study Bible, that I read on a regular basis. I'm trying not to Jesus juke anybody here, but like, I'm interested in things. My mind works in ways that when I go talk to a middle school camp, that's just not where they are. And that's not what they're thinking. And so I have to be sure that after I develop what I'm going to talk about, that I'm thinking through that lens of, but what is most beneficial, what is most helpful for where they are, for them to understand what it means to take that next step in their faith.
That's really good. Yeah. I've noticed that too. And I've talked with some other youth pastors too, and them asking, when they're first starting out in ministry, what do I do during the week as well? And I tell them, I was like, I'd spend, sometimes almost equal time studying the Bible, but also studying teenage culture. And studying, where they are, what's popular, what words are they using, what language are they using, that kind of thing, because it's so important. Like, we need to be able to bridge that gap between the Bible and now bring it to 2021 and how we actually connect that. Because that's I feel like that's part of our jobs
absolutely.
As youth pastors, is like, we've got to be able to bridge that gap, because if not, it's going to be so hard for teenagers to naturally do that on their own.
Yeah,
that's huge. Well, Brett, I'm sure that people are going to want to connect with you. And so what's the best places for people to connect with you? Where did they go online to be able to pick your brain and ask you more questions or follow up on anything that you've talked about today?
Nowhere. I'm a ghost, Steve.
That is a lie.
Everything is pretty much Brett Ryan Talley. Middle name is Ryan. And so BrettRyanTalley.com, at Brett Ryan Talley on Twitter, at Brett Ryan Talley on Instagram, Brett, BRETT, two T's, Brett at thinkorange.com is my email address. So whether you use Orange or don't use Orange, if you want to connect with me over email and follow up with some questions, or, hey, what did you mean by this, or something along those lines, don't hesitate to shoot me a message there either.
Cool. And it'd be weird of me to avoid this altogether. So I know there's other Orange people out there that want me to ask this. When's the podcast coming back?
Oh my gosh, Steve. We could talk for so long about this. Yeah. So we had this dream that finally came to fruition years ago, the Rethinking Youth Ministry podcast, where a bunch of us on the Orange Students team got to be honest, just finally got to start recording some of the conversations that we had been having. And we loved doing it. And, it seemed like it was hitting a need with a lot of people. You and I have talked about this. There's a lot of great student ministry podcasts in that space. So we're not going to pretend like we were the best ones, or that, there's a gap just because we're not out there right now. But yeah, when COVID hit and life changed for everybody, that was one of those things that shifted for us. And we've had to put a pause on that. And as somebody who got to be regularly involved in that podcast, there are few things I want more than to sit around a circle with some of those people again and start diving back into some of those conversations and questions. And I wish I had a date for you. I'm so glad you asked, Steve. Next week.
Right. Exclusive.
It doesn't exist right now. And we don't really have a specific timeline. Everybody wants it to come back. It's just one of those things, budget allocation, time allocation, all of those things that we all know about with the church, especially, in the midst of everything that's happened over the past couple of years. So the closest, here's my little plug. The closest you can get to a Rethinking Youth Ministry podcast is scheduling time with me, Candace, or Charlie, and having a conversation with your Orange specialist about those kind of things that we would have
It's your personalized podcast.
There we go. your individualized podcast.
And you
really
still
the
have
roundtables.
Yeah.
And the roundtables that we do are a lot like that. I mean, it's sometimes 4 or 5, sometimes 10, 11, but people just kind of going around and sharing and kind of working through some stuff together.
Yeah, absolutely. And you still have the whole catalog of already recorded podcasts that they can go back and listen to as well.
I don't know how many. I know we hit 100 somewhere along the lines because I was on that episode. But yeah, we've got a bunch. orangestudents.com. If you aren't sure about the Rethinking Youth Ministry podcast and want to go back and cherry pick some episodes, there's a bunch there.
Yeah, that's cool. And I love the fact that a lot of people have asked me before about the Orange Conference, Orange stuff and everything. They're like, do we have to buy into the curriculum? And that's the big thing. You don't have to. They have tons of resources. You guys have all these different things, from the podcast to books to conferences to everything in between, or just, being able to have you guys, a phone call or Zoom or whatever away. You have so much more than just the curriculum. And
I always say that, there's a lot of people out there who use Orange, but there's a lot of people out there who think Orange, but don't necessarily use the content itself, and the philosophies and the strategies and all of those pieces still, overlap and completely shape and color everything that they do in ministry, but they're just not necessarily using curriculum. And I always tell people, like, God didn't call me to lead your ministry. God called you to lead your ministry, or you felt compelled, hashtag from earlier, to lead that ministry. And so by no means do I feel like I can tell everybody, like, oh, XP3 is a perfect fit for what you guys are doing. I love our team. I believe in what we do. But for sure, there are a billion ways to continue to lead really well using a lot of the different resources and strategies and different things that we talk about without, actually having to use XP3 on a weekly basis.
Absolutely. Well, Brett, it's been awesome to have you on the podcast. Always great to talk with you. And thank you for all you do for our church, but also all the other churches out there. And God bless your ministry and then all that you're doing for the kingdom.
Steve, my friend, I miss being able to see you at tour and conference and YMX and all the different things. So hopefully soon we will see each other.
Hopefully.
Thanks for having me on, bud.
It was so great to have Brett on the podcast, and be sure to connect with him, especially if there is an Orange event or another event where Orange is there and you're able to meet Brett in person. Go do it. It's a great conversation. But also be sure to reach out to him. All those links that he talked about are going to be in our show notes and more, so make sure you check those out. And also be sure to check out the links for our sponsors of this episode, G-Shades at gshades.org, and be sure to use the promo code TSMPOD to save 10% off your order. Also, thanks to Men Hub Youth, and you can go over to minhubsync.com/SMP. And not only are you going to be able to check out their stuff, but you're also going to be able to support the Student Ministry podcast by heading to that link. Again, all those are in the show notes, along with our social media links. Be sure to follow us on all social medias that you can, so you can stay up to date with what's going on in the world of the Student Ministry podcast. And you can also reach out to me and suggest someone else that we should get on a future podcast. Maybe you know a youth worker out there that really needs to be we need to have them on the show so that we can talk to them about their story and what God's been doing through their life and their ministry. So be sure to reach out to us on social media as well. Again, be sure to subscribe, and if you can, leave a positive rating. That's very, very helpful, and share this with other youth workers out there. We're going to be back next time with another conversation with another amazing youth worker, but until then, may God bless your ministry.